Northeast Wisconsin businesses are being recognized as top workplaces by the people who know them best, their own employees. The honor comes from Energage, which ran a staff survey as part of the program with USA Today Network Wisconsin. One of the organizations making the list again this year, Kaukauna Area School District. Congratulations. Superintendent Mike Slowinski says the recognition means a lot because it's based on how staff feel about coming to work.
We've been, very fortunate that we work with such passionate educators who come here every day in Kaukauna and give it their all and, make sure that their talents and passions really are directed toward helping our students to fulfill their dreams and their potential.
District survey staff twice a year uses that feedback to make changes, helping Kaukauna keep about 95% of its employees each of the last 3 years.